Under the hard Nevada sky, a widow sits in a lawyer's lamplit office as destiny is read aloud. Inherit the ranch, only if she marries within 6 months. Outside, a ruthless banker circles. Inside, a sister-in-law smiles too sweetly. Duty demands a bargain. Desire whispers of danger. One glance from a stoic rancher, one silver locket pressed to a guarded heart. Secrets tremble, and a past that refuses to stay buried begins to stir. When truth collides with pride, which vow will hold survival or love? Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and what draws you most to historical romances, the slow burn longing, the class conflicts, or the fierce, resilient heroines. Carson City, Nevada, 1869. The desert wind swept fine dust through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant stables. Inside the somber office of Mr. Charles Wentworth, the town's most respected attorney, the air was still, heavy with the scent of oiled wood and paper aged by time. Margaret Maggie Keene sat rigid in the straight-backed chair, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a black calico dress of modest cut, the high collar brushing against her throat like a restraint. A small silver locket, hidden beneath the bodice, pressed cold against her skin. Her hazel eyes, bright yet shadowed by the long months of mourning, fixed on the lawyer as though bracing for a verdict. To her right, Abigail Keene held herself with the stiff pride of a woman convinced of her own virtue. Her silk gown of somber violet rustled with every impatient shift, the black bonnet shadowing eyes that assessed Maggie with something colder than grief. Across the desk, Mr. Wentworth's spectacles caught the pale light from the window, his voice measured, his words deliberate. He began with formalities, reciting the division of small possessions, the settling of debts. Then, in a tone as if weighed down by its own gravity, he delivered the clause that stilled the room. The Keene Ranch, every acre, every fence post, every breath of wind that touched its fields would pass to Maggie only if she remarried within 6 months of her husband's death. A faint gasp escaped Maggie's lips, quickly stifled. Abigail's mouth curved in something that might have been sympathy, but her eyes glittered with satisfaction. Mr. Wentworth hesitated before adding, almost reluctantly, that this stipulation had likely been influenced by Abigail's counsel to the deceased, concerns about whether a woman alone could manage so large an estate. "I have always believed," Abigail murmured, her tone as sweet as spoiled honey, "that the ranch would be better served under a man's direction. Henry Dorsey has expressed interest. He is capable." The banker's name hung in the air like a threat. Maggie knew Dorsey's ambition was as boundless as the desert sky and twice as merciless. She rose, smoothing her skirts, her voice quiet but unshaken. "The ranch is mine, Abigail, and it will remain so." That evening, the chill of early spring settled over Carson City. Lamps glowed behind shop windows, casting pools of gold onto the wooden sidewalks. Maggie walked with measured steps toward the mercantile, her thoughts a tangle of indignation and fear. As she passed the hitching post, a tall figure emerged from the shadows, a man with broad shoulders beneath a worn wool vest, the brim of his felt hat casting his steel-gray eyes in shadow. Luke Branner inclined his head in greeting, his voice low and steady. "Evening, Mrs. Keene." The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. She offered a polite nod, her gaze meeting his for only a moment before slipping away. Yet in that brief exchange, something unspoken lingered, an awareness, a possibility. And as Maggie continued down the lamplit street, her heart still tight with the day's revelations, an idea began to take root. The morning sun over Carson City rose pale and reluctant, its light stretching across the valley with a muted gold that softened the jagged outlines of the mountains. Maggie Keene stood at the edge of her yard, gazing toward the open road that led out to the Branner place. The air was crisp with the scent of sagebrush, and a light wind lifted the hem of her dark calico skirt. She held her gloved hands together, the leather warming against her palms as she steadied her breath. She had not slept much the night before. The reading of the will had left her mind restless, turning over possibilities like cards in a gambler's hand. Only one face had returned to her thoughts again and again, a man whose presence seemed as immovable as the Nevada hills, yet whose life she knew only in glimpses: Luke Branner. The decision was bold to the point of recklessness, but the will's cruel stipulation left her with little else. She cinched her shawl tighter and began the walk to his ranch. The journey took her beyond the town's scattered buildings and into the open land where fences stretched like quiet sentinels across the fields. Dust clung to her boots, and the wind pulled at the ribbon of her bonnet, but she pressed forward, each step measured, each thought weighed. Luke's property came into view, a modest house of weathered timber with a narrow porch, a corral to one side, and a barn that leaned slightly from years of sun and wind. A pair of horses grazed in the distance, their tails flicking lazily. She paused at the gate, taking in the quiet order of the place, and then pushed it open with a creak that seemed far too loud for the stillness. Luke emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in hand. His shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, marked with the faint scars of hard labor. His dark hair, touched with silver at the temples, caught the light, and his steel-gray eyes fixed on her with the cautious regard of a man unaccustomed to surprise visitors. "Mrs. Keene," he said, his voice low, carrying the faint rasp of someone who had seen both wind and war. "This is a long walk from town. What brings you here?" Maggie stepped forward, the wooden boards of the porch creaking beneath her boots. "I've come to speak to you about a matter of business, one that may be of interest to us both." He studied her for a moment before leaning the pitchfork against the barn wall. "Business?" "Yes," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I will speak plainly, Mr. Branner. I have found myself in a position that requires unconventional measures. The will my husband left contains a condition, one that could cost me the Keene Ranch unless I marry again within 6 months. His expression did not change, though something in his gaze sharpened. "And you've come to me?" "I have." She lifted her chin slightly, aware that the wind had loosened a strand of hair from her chignon. "I am not asking for love, nor companionship. I propose a marriage in name only, one that benefits us both. You would have certain rights to my land that could ease your own burdens. I would secure my claim to the ranch." Luke crossed his arms, the shadow of the barn falling across half his face. "You speak as if I would leap at such an arrangement." "I speak as if you are a man who understands necessity," she said quietly, "and I know you have seen your share of it." His eyes flickered, just briefly, but the guarded distance returned almost at once. "I don't make decisions based on rumors." "This is no rumor," she replied. "Hank Dorsey has been circling my land like a vulture. He's pressuring other ranchers too, isn't he?" "I've heard the talk." Luke's jaw tightened, a muscle shifting in his cheek. For a moment, the silence between them was broken only by the restless snort of a horse from the corral. "He's made his offers," Luke admitted at last. "Offers I've refused." "And how long before he tries to take what you won't sell?" Maggie asked, her voice firm, but not unkind. "This could be the answer for both of us." He looked away toward the horizon, as if the distant mountains could offer counsel. "Marriage is not something I take lightly, Mrs. Keene, even one of convenience." "Nor do I," she said. "But the choice has been taken from me. This way, at least, we choose the terms ourselves." He studied her for a long moment, and in that gaze Maggie felt the weight of a man measuring not just her words, but the steel beneath them. At length, he gave a slow nod. "If we were to do this, there would have to be rules." She exhaled softly, her pulse easing. "Agreed. No intimacy," he began, his tone even. "No expectations beyond what we agree on paper. And no talk of this arrangement beyond those who must know." "That suits me," she replied, "and it will remain a strictly practical matter." Luke stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing to where she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way the sun had deepened his skin. "Then we will need a witness, someone we both trust. Sarah Whitaker," Maggie said without hesitation. "She will keep her silence." By the time the agreement was sealed, the sun had shifted toward its descent, bathing the land in a warm amber light. They walked together to the edge of the property, where Luke saddled his horse. The ride into town was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats steady against the packed earth. The courthouse stood at the far end of Main Street, its brick walls glowing in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink and old timber. Sarah was waiting, her honey-blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, her blue eyes widening only slightly at the sight of them together. Luke spoke to the clerk in his steady, unhurried way, and papers were produced. Maggie signed her name with a hand that did not tremble, though her breath caught once when Luke's fingers brushed hers as he took the pen. His signature followed, bold and precise. When the vows were spoken, they were stripped of romance, recited in the plain language of duty. Yet something passed between them in that moment, a current of recognition perhaps, or the silent acknowledgement of two lives now bound by choice and necessity. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the last of the sunlight painted the street in tones of copper and rose. Sarah offered them both a quiet smile, her gaze lingering on Maggie, as if to say more than her words could carry. Maggie looked up at Luke. "Well," she said softly, "we have done it." He adjusted the brim of his hat, his eyes unreadable. "We have." And as they walked down the steps, side by side yet not touching, the dust rose gently around their boots, carrying the scent of the high desert into the approaching night. The day Maggie Keene crossed the threshold of Luke Branner's ranch house, the sky hung low with pale clouds that promised rain but gave none. The air carried that faint metallic scent before a storm, mingled with the dry sweetness of the sagebrush that bordered the path. Her boots crunched softly against the worn wooden steps of the porch, each footfall sounding louder than she wished. She paused at the door, her gloved fingers tightening on the small carpet bag that held her most necessary possessions. Luke stood to one side, holding the door open without a word. He was dressed in his usual work shirt and wool vest, a shadow of stubble darkening his jaw. The brim of his hat was tipped back slightly, allowing her to meet the cool steel grey of his eyes. He did not rush her, but there was something in his posture, an unspoken reminder that this was not a homecoming, merely the first step in an arrangement they had agreed to. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather, wood smoke, and the distant trace of tobacco. The rooms were plainly furnished, a narrow hallway leading into a parlor with two chairs set before a stone hearth, a simple table in the corner with mismatched chairs, and beyond that, a kitchen with shelves of plain crockery and iron cookware. Everything was neat, almost too neat, as though order was a shield against intrusion. "You can take the room at the end of the hall," Luke said, his voice low and even. "There's a wardrobe, a washstand, and a small writing desk." "Thank you," she replied, stepping inside. The floorboards creaked faintly under her weight, and her gaze drifted over the sparse decor. No curtains softened the windows, no small tokens of sentiment broke the monotony of the walls. It was a man's house, shaped by function, not comfort. She carried her bag to the room he had indicated. The space was modest, with a narrow bed neatly made, a quilt folded at its foot. She set her bag on the bed, glancing at the wardrobe where she would hang her dresses, and the writing desk where perhaps she might keep her accounts. She had no illusions about the nature of this arrangement, yet the air in this room already felt heavy with the need for unspoken boundaries. The first days passed in a careful rhythm of avoidance. Luke rose before dawn, the sound of his boots on the porch boards marking his departure for the barn or the fields. Maggie kept to her tasks, preparing simple meals, sweeping the floors, keeping her own room in order. At the table, their conversations were sparse, confined to practical matters. She found his manner brusque, his answers brief, yet there was an unspoken civility in the way he held the chair for her before sitting, or in the way his gaze occasionally lingered on her hands as she poured his coffee. On the fourth afternoon, a knock at the door broke the quiet. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and opened it to find Sarah Whitaker standing there, her honey-blonde hair pinned neatly, her eyes warm but shadowed with concern. "I thought I'd call on you, Maggie," Sarah said, stepping inside. "I wanted to see how you were settling in." Maggie offered her tea, and they sat in the parlor. Sarah's gaze swept the tidy room before she leaned closer, her voice dropping. "You know Hank Dorsey will not let this go. He's already been pressing others in town, and Abigail, well, she's been seen speaking with him more than once this week. She's stirring talk. Some are saying this marriage was rushed for a reason." Maggie's jaw tightened, though she kept her voice calm. "They may talk all they wish. I've learned that truth is not the currency most people value." Sarah's eyes softened. "Just be careful. He's persistent, and Abigail knows where to find the smallest cracks." After Sarah left, the house felt even quieter than before. Luke returned from the fields at dusk, his boots carrying the scent of dust and hay. Maggie was setting the table when the clasp of her locket gave way, the silver chain slipping through her fingers and falling to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, her heart pinching at the thought of it broken. The locket had been her mother's, the only keepsake she carried close each day. Luke's voice came from behind her. "Let me see that." She hesitated, then placed it in his open palm. His fingers were rough from work, the lines of his knuckles etched deep by sun and labor, yet he held the delicate piece as if it were made of spun glass. Without another word, he retrieved a small tin from the shelf, taking out a thin tool and a loop of wire. Maggie stood near the table, watching as he bent over the locket beneath the glow of the oil lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There," he said at last, fastening the clasp with a precise motion. He held it out to her, his gaze meeting hers in the lamplight. "It should hold." "Thank you," she said softly, feeling an unfamiliar warmth beneath her ribs. She fastened the locket back around her neck, the cool silver settling against her skin. The next morning, the sky was a clear, endless blue, and the air carried the scent of fresh-cut hay from the fields beyond the barn. Maggie rose early, tying her hair in a neat chignon before stepping into the kitchen. She had decided, without telling herself why, to prepare something more than the usual fare. She set to work with measured care, mixing batter for griddle cakes, frying slices of salted pork and steeping a pot of coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and rich, and when Luke entered, his steps slowed. "This smells familiar," he said, his voice lower than usual. "My mother used to make a breakfast like this on Sundays," she replied, placing a plate before him. "I thought it might be a good way to start the day." He sat, his fork pausing briefly before the first bite. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, barely there, but enough for her to notice. "Haven't had this since I was a boy," he said, and for the first time his tone carried something gentler. They ate without haste, the silence between them no longer edged with the sharpness of strangers, but tempered into something quieter, more tentative. The clink of cutlery, the low crackle from the hearth, the occasional creak of the old floorboards, all these sounds wove around them like the threads of a fragile truce. As the days lengthened, the air between them shifted almost imperceptibly. He continued to speak little, but his gaze softened when she passed him a cup of coffee or set a fresh loaf of bread on the table. She, in turn, found herself noticing the care he took with his work, the way he repaired a loose shutter before the wind could rattle it, the steady patience with which he calmed a restless horse. The arrangement remained as they had agreed, bound by discretion and distance. Yet in the small acts that neither of them named, his mending of her locket, her recalling a breakfast from his childhood, something unspoken began to take root in the quiet spaces of the house, beneath the weight of the Nevada sky. The morning began with the low hum of wind across the valley, a restless murmur that seemed to seep through the wooden slats of the Branner ranch house. The sun had only begun its climb, casting a pale gold light that softened the hard lines of the Nevada hills. Maggie moved quietly through the kitchen, her hands busy with the measured rhythm of preparing breakfast, the faint aroma of coffee mingling with the scent of fresh bread cooling on the counter. Luke had already left for the barn, the sound of his boots on the porch boards fading into the distance. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of timber settling. Maggie found herself enjoying these brief pockets of solitude. They gave her room to think, to breathe, to order her thoughts before the day's labors claimed her. The knock, when it came, was sharp and insistent. It startled her enough to make the knife in her hand pause above a slice of bread. Setting it down, she wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the front door. When she opened it, the sight of Henry Hank Dorsey standing on the porch turned the morning air colder. He was dressed in an expensive dark wool suit, a brocade vest gleaming faintly beneath his open coat. A gold watch chain curved across his chest, and in his gloved hand he leaned casually on a silver-handled cane. The small, assessing smile on his lips did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Branner," he said smoothly, his voice oiled with false courtesy. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." Maggie stepped into the doorway, her fingers tightening on the frame. "It is early for calls, Mr. Dorsey. Is there something you require?" He tilted his head, as if amused by her formality. "Only a word or two. I hear you've made a surprising change in circumstances. Quite the swift transition from widowhood to matrimony." His gaze swept deliberately over her, pausing just long enough to be felt. "Naturally, the town is curious." Her spine straightened. "The town's curiosity is none of my concern." "Perhaps," he replied, leaning slightly on his cane, "but it might become the concern of the county registrar. You see, Mrs. Branner, rushed unions tend to invite questions. Questions about intent, authenticity, whether they are truly marriages at all or merely convenient arrangements." She held his gaze, though her heart thudded in her chest. "If you have something to say it plainly, Mr. Dorsey." His smile sharpened. "Only that certain clauses in certain wills can be contested, should someone present compelling doubts. It would be unfortunate if such matters were brought to light, especially for a woman with so much to lose." The heavy sound of approaching footsteps drew both their attention. Luke emerged from the side of the house, the brim of his felt hat casting a shadow across his eyes. His broad frame seemed to fill the space between them, and the dust on his boots spoke of hours of work already done. "Dorsey," he said, his voice flat but edged with steel. "You're a long way from your office." Hank's expression flickered, but he kept his tone light. "Just paying a friendly visit, offering my congratulations to your bride." Luke's eyes narrowed, and Maggie felt the shift in the air, the way tension gathered between the two men like the charged stillness before lightning strikes. "If you have business here," Luke said slowly, "you can say it to me." "Your wife and I were simply discussing how quickly fortunes can change," Hank replied, tapping his cane lightly against the porch rail, "and how precarious they can be when built on shaky foundations." Luke stepped closer, close enough that Maggie could see the fine dust on his vest and the faint tightness in his jaw. "You come here uninvited, making threats you think sound clever. Don't mistake my silence for tolerance, Dorsey. This is our land, and our marriage is not your concern." The banker's smile thinned. "We'll see about that." With a brief tip of his hat, he turned and walked down the porch steps, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel before his figure disappeared down the road. Maggie closed the door slowly, the echo of Hank's voice lingering like a stain on the air. Luke looked at her, his gaze steady, searching. "Did he say anything else?" "Only what you heard," she replied, unwilling to let her unease show. He studied her a moment longer before nodding and stepping back toward the kitchen. She followed, though her mind was not in the room. Hank's words had been laced with more than idle threat. They carried the weight of someone who knew precisely where to strike. Later that day, the truth of his intentions reached her through another channel. Sarah came by in the afternoon, her cheeks flushed from the brisk air, her expression troubled. She lingered by the door as if weighing whether to speak, then said quietly, "I saw Abigail in town this morning. She was with Hank Dorsey, and they weren't just exchanging pleasantries. She was telling him about your first marriage, about the child you lost." Maggie's breath caught, the air thick in her throat. That grief was a part of her she had locked away, a wound she did not expose to idle eyes. The thought of Abigail offering it up to Hank as fodder for gossip left her feeling stripped bare in the middle of the street. "Why?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because it makes you vulnerable," Sarah said gently. "They want people to question you, to see you as unfit to hold that ranch on your own, or even with Luke." Maggie thanked her friend and assured her she would manage. But when the door closed and she was alone again, the weight of it pressed hard against her chest. She kept her posture straight, her movements deliberate, unwilling to let the hurt seep into her face where Luke might read it. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the sky in hues of amber and rose, Luke returned from the far pasture. They sat to supper, the lamplight warm on the table between them. He spoke little, but his eyes lingered on her more than usual, as if he sensed the undercurrent of her thoughts. When she met his gaze, there was no pity there, only a quiet, unyielding steadiness. She found herself both comforted and unsettled by it. Perhaps he did not know the details of what Abigail had said, but she suspected he had guessed enough. The meal passed in relative silence, but there was a different quality to it now, a subtle thread binding them, woven from the knowledge that the walls they had built around themselves might not keep out every storm. And though Maggie would not give Hank Dorsey or Abigail the satisfaction of seeing her falter, she felt for the first time the faintest pull toward the man across the table, not as a convenient partner, but as someone whose presence might one day mean more than she dared to admit. The afternoon sky over Carson City had taken on the strange, bruised hue that came before a dust storm. From the porch of the Branner Ranch house, the distant mountains were veiled in a pale, shifting haze, and the air was heavy with the scent of dry earth stirred by restless winds. Maggie stood just inside the doorway, her shawl clutched around her shoulders, watching the horizon dissolve into a moving wall of dust. Luke was in the yard, securing the barn doors against the rising gusts. His hat brim was pulled low, and his coat whipped about him in the wind's grip. She watched him with an odd tightness in her chest, the figure of a man who faced the elements without flinching, whose silence seemed born from something deeper than mere reserve. When he strode toward the house, his boots crunching on the gravel path, she stepped aside to let him in, closing the door firmly against the roar outside. "Storm's coming fast," he said, brushing the dust from his sleeves. "Best we stay put. Could last into the night." The house quickly grew dim as the sunlight was swallowed by the amber gloom outside. Luke lit 2 oil lamps, their soft glow flickering over the plain furnishings, casting shadows on the walls. The wind rattled the windows, and the sound of sand striking the glass was like 1,000 tiny fists. Maggie set the kettle on the stove, the familiar motions of making tea offering a fragile anchor against the storm's wildness. They sat at the table, the lamplight pooling between them. For a while the only sounds were the wind and the faint bubbling of the kettle. Maggie sipped her tea, feeling the weight of Luke's presence across from her. The closeness was different here, stripped of the daily distractions. There was nowhere to go, nothing to occupy their hands except the small, dangerous possibility of conversation. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm always quiet," he replied with a faint trace of a smile. But there was a softness in his eyes, as though the storm outside had given him permission to lower the guard he carried like armor. She set her cup down, fingers resting against its warmth. "I suppose, if we are to share a roof, we might as well know more than each other's names and habits." His gaze held hers for a moment, steady and unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, his hands loosely clasped before him. "If you wish." It was she who spoke first, her voice low but steady, as though each word was weighed before being offered. "My first marriage was not what people might have believed. To the town, we were a respectable couple. Behind closed doors, it was different. He was often away, and when he was here, his mind and his affections were elsewhere." Her eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again, their hazel depths catching the lamplight. "I learned of his infidelities one by one. At first, I told myself they were nothing, a passing thing, but they were not. They were deliberate. And when our child died," her voice faltered, a breath catching in her throat, "I was left with grief, and the knowledge that even that loss could not bring him back to me in truth." Luke's jaw tightened, though not in judgment. "That is a hard thing to carry. It taught me not to trust what is spoken in tender moments," she said, her tone bitter and wistful in equal measure. "Words can be soft as silk and just as easy to tear." The wind howled outside, as if to underscore her confession. For a time, neither spoke. Then Luke's voice broke the silence, deep and measured. "I know something of betrayal myself." Her eyes searched his face. "From the war?" "In part," he said, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "I fought in the cavalry. There's a certain bond you expect in such places, a trust that the man beside you will stand fast when the line breaks. I saw that trust shattered more than once. Men turning away in the moment of need or leaving others to pay the cost for their cowardice." His gaze shifted, darkened, "And when I came back, there was a woman I thought I'd marry. We had an understanding, or so I believed. She waited, or claimed to. But while I was gone, she'd promised herself to someone else, a man with more land, more money. I learned of their engagement from a neighbor before she had the courage to tell me." Maggie's fingers tightened around her cup, the china warm against her skin. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He gave a short, almost humorless smile. "It was a long time ago, but it made certain things clear. I'd rather live with solitude than gamble on another's loyalty." They fell into silence again, but it was a different kind than before. The air between them seemed warmer, threaded with a fragile understanding. The storm outside roared and rattled, but here, inside these walls, they had uncovered pieces of each other that few had ever been allowed to see. The kettle's whistle broke the stillness. Maggie rose to refill their cups, brushing past him in the narrow space between table and stove. Her sleeve caught lightly against his arm, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected rush of awareness through her. She set the teapot down, her movements suddenly more deliberate, as though measured against the tremor beneath her skin. When she returned to the table, Luke's eyes followed her, not with the guarded distance she had grown used to, but with something quieter, more searching. She met his gaze, and the moment stretched, long enough for her to feel the weight of it in her chest. Neither spoke, and yet the air seemed to carry words they dared not say. He reached out, not quite touching her, but close enough that the warmth of his hand reached her across the small space. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat, the rest of the world, storm, past all of it, faded to nothing. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then lifted again to meet her eyes. The distance between them narrowed, but not entirely. They lingered on that edge, balanced between what was safe and what was not. Then, as if some unspoken agreement passed between them, they each leaned back slightly, the spell breaking as softly as it had formed. Outside, the storm began to wane, the wind's fury giving way to a gentler whisper. Maggie rose and moved to the window, looking out at the dim shapes of the land slowly re-emerging from the dust. Behind her, she could feel Luke's presence, solid and near, and though they had stepped back from whatever might have happened, something had shifted. Neither of them named it, but as the night settled in, there was a new thread woven between them. Thin, perhaps, but strong enough to catch the light when the day came again. The chill of early autumn had settled over Carson City, the mornings crisp enough that Maggie could see her breath as she stepped out to fetch water from the pump. The air was clear, the sky a pale, endless blue, yet beneath its openness there was a feeling, one she could not name, that seemed to cling to the days of late. Conversations in town grew shorter when she passed, the warmth of certain greetings now replaced with polite nods or sidelong glances. Whispers had begun to follow her like shadows that lengthened toward evening. It was Luke who first gave shape to the unease. He came back from the mercantile one afternoon, his steps heavier than usual, his hat pulled low as though to keep his expression hidden. When he set the sack of flour on the kitchen table, he stayed standing, his gaze fixed on her in a way that carried more weight than words. "There's talk," he said finally, his voice low and even. "Talk that someone in the county office is looking into our marriage, whether it's binding." Maggie felt the air tighten around her. "Looking into it? Why?" "Because Hank Dorsey put someone up to it," Luke replied, taking off his hat and setting it on the table. "I heard from a man in town, said he'd seen Dorsey with one of the clerks from the courthouse. Money changed hands." Her fingers stilled on the loaf of bread she had been slicing. "So he means to have the marriage questioned. If he can prove it's not valid, he gets what he's wanted all along." Luke finished, his jaw taut. "The ranch." She set the knife down carefully, though inside her pulse had begun to race. "And Abigail?" His silence was answer enough. Later that day, confirmation came in another form. Sarah Whitaker arrived, cheeks flushed from the wind, her expression grave. She removed her gloves slowly, as if weighing her words before speaking them aloud. "Maggie, Abigail is in Hank Dorsey's company more often than propriety allows. And she's been saying things that the clause in your husband's will was put there because you couldn't manage the ranch yourself, that you'd have sold it already if you'd been left on your own." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "And people believe her?" Sarah's eyes softened with regret. "Some do. Others are simply eager to repeat the words without caring whether they're true." Luke stood by the hearth, arms crossed, his gaze steady on Maggie. "We could stop this," he said. "We could annul the arrangement. If the marriage isn't there to be questioned, Dorsey loses the ground he's standing on." Maggie met his eyes, the lamplight catching the warm flecks in her hazel gaze. "And hand him the ranch? No, Luke. I will not let him take what is mine, no matter the cost to my name. I've lived through worse than gossip." His expression shifted, something between frustration and reluctant respect, but he did not press her further. 2 weeks later, the barn raising took place at the Miller farm, a gathering that drew most of the community. The air smelled of fresh-cut timber and sawdust, mingling with the smoke from cooking fires where women tended kettles of stew. The sound of hammers striking nails echoed against the hills, blending with laughter and the steady rhythm of work. Maggie had come with a basket of bread and preserves, her sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists. She moved among the women, offering food, exchanging pleasantries, though she was acutely aware of certain eyes that lingered too long, certain smiles that held a trace of something unkind beneath their politeness. Luke was on the far side of the frame, working shoulder to shoulder with the other men. His height made him easy to spot, the sunlight catching in his dark hair as he moved with steady precision. She allowed herself a moment to watch him. How he carried the weight of the beams without complaint, how naturally others seemed to fall in step with his pace. It was Sarah who found her later, her face pale beneath the brim of her hat. "Maggie," she whispered, touching her arm, "come with me." They stepped behind the barn, where the wind carried the scent of hay and the voices from the worksite were faint. Sarah leaned closer. "I overheard Hank speaking to one of the county men. He said that once the investigation into your marriage is finished, he'll move to foreclose. He believes he can prove you don't have the funds to meet the ranch's tax payments this winter." Maggie's breath caught. "That's a lie." "I know," Sarah said, "but he's confident enough to say it aloud. He means to make it true if he can." For a moment, Maggie stared past her friend at the sweep of open land beyond the fence. She thought of her mother's locket, of the mornings spent tending the ranch she had fought to keep, of the quiet dignity in Luke's way of working the land. A flicker of anger rose in her chest, steadying her like a hand on her back. "Then he has just declared his intentions," Maggie said, her voice firm, "and he's given me reason enough to meet him head-on." When she returned to the main yard, Luke caught sight of her. His brow furrowed at whatever he saw in her face, but he said nothing as he went back to his work. The day stretched on, the barn's frame rising higher against the sky, but for Maggie, the shape that loomed in her mind was not of timber and nails. It was of the fight that lay ahead, one she would not enter quietly. By the time the sun sank low, painting the valley in gold and shadow, the barn stood half-finished, a testament to what could be built when a community worked together. Yet for Maggie, the day's true gain was not in the building before her, but in the knowledge passed to her in hushed tones behind its walls. She carried it home in silence, her thoughts sharpening with each mile, the weight of resolve settling over her like the cooling evening air. In the quiet of the house that night, she set her shawl over the back of the chair and looked at Luke across the lamplit kitchen. "He's coming for us," she said simply. Luke studied her, the flicker of the flame catching in his eyes. "Then we'd best be ready." And though no formal pact was spoken, something in the air between them shifted, a silent agreement that whatever storms Hank Dorsey meant to bring, they would face them not as strangers bound by convenience, but as two people standing on the same ground, unwilling to yield. The morning dawned deceptively still, the kind of pale, quiet day that seemed to promise nothing more than a gentle wind and the hum of routine work. Yet Maggie sensed a different weight in the air, one that settled over her shoulders before she had even left her room. From the kitchen window, she saw a wagon rolling up the dusty road, its wheels cutting shallow lines into the earth. Two men in dark coats sat on the bench, their posture rigid, their gaze fixed on the house. By the time the knock came at the front door, Luke had already stepped inside from the yard, brushing the dust from his sleeves. She met his eyes briefly, reading the silent warning there. He opened the door to find two county officials, clipboards in hand, the glint of authority in their eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Ibrana," the taller one said, his voice carrying the tone of formal procedure. "We've been sent to conduct a routine inspection regarding the legitimacy of your marriage and the management of this property." Maggie's breath caught, though her face remained calm. She could almost hear Hank Dorsey's voice behind those words, as if he had been standing outside with them moments before, planting seeds of doubt. Luke stepped aside to let them in, his tone clipped but polite. "You'll find what you need." The officials moved through the rooms with deliberate slowness, making notes, occasionally asking questions that seemed designed to trip them. "When did you first meet? Who proposed? How long have you lived under the same roof?" Each question was laced with an insinuation they did not bother to disguise. Maggie felt Luke's hand find the small of her back as they moved from the parlor to the kitchen. It was a simple gesture, but there was a steadiness in it that grounded her. She answered the questions clearly, her voice warm where his was edged with steel. At one point, one of the officials remarked on the lack of personal items in the shared bedroom, his eyes flicking toward the neatly made bed. Maggie smiled faintly, leaning just enough toward Luke for the gesture to seem natural. "We keep a tidy home. There's comfort in order." Her hand brushed his forearm lightly, the contact lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. They followed the officials out to the porch, where the questions continued. Luke's arms settled around her shoulders now, his thumb brushing the curve of her collarbone in what seemed like an unconscious motion. It was meant for their audience, yet something in her chest tightened at the ease with which he did it. She glanced up at him and caught the briefest flicker of warmth in his eyes, an expression that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. The officials left at last, their departure marked by the creak of the wagon wheels and the fading cloud of dust. Maggie stepped back into the house, the silence behind the closed door wrapping around them. That was no routine inspection. Luke said, his voice low. "No," she replied. "Hank sent them. He wanted us to stumble." They stood for a moment in the narrow space between the kitchen and the parlor, their breaths still slightly uneven from the performance. Maggie realized she had not thought of it as a performance by the end. Her hand on his arm around her shoulders, the way his eyes had softened. All of it had begun as necessity, but somewhere in the answering of questions and the quiet glances exchanged between them, the line between truth and pretense had blurred. By the time afternoon gave way to evening, the gossip had already begun to shift. Sarah stopped by briefly, her expression brighter than it had been in weeks. "Whatever happened here today," she said with a knowing smile, "it's traveling through town faster than the wind. People are saying you two looked devoted. Hank will have a harder time twisting that into something against you." After she left, Luke remained in the parlor while Maggie cleared the table from their supper. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze distant. Somewhere between the morning's tension and the quiet of the present moment, something had shifted inside him. He told himself it was the way she had held her composure under scrutiny, the unshakable steadiness of her voice. But there was more, the warmth of her hand against his arm, the subtle way she had leaned toward him without needing to be told. It was no longer just the bargain keeping her here. He did not speak it aloud, but he knew with a clarity that startled him that his feelings for her had slipped beyond the terms they had set. Later that night, as Maggie prepared to retire to her room, she found a folded envelope tucked under the edge of the door. There was no name on it, only her own, written in a careful hand. She hesitated, then opened it, the lamplight falling across the page. The words were direct, unadorned, and they sent a sharp current through her. "Hank has bribed county officials. He means to use their findings to foreclose on your land. He has already threatened others to keep them from speaking against him. You will need proof. This letter is the beginning. There is more I can tell you, but it must be done carefully. Trust only a few." The final line was signed simply, "A friend." She read it twice, her mind already piecing together the truth beneath the words. The handwriting was familiar, though not immediately placed. When she folded the letter again, she caught sight of Luke leaning in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. "Not bad," she said, slipping the letter into the pocket of her skirt. "Just confirmation of what we already know." His eyes held hers for a long moment, and she felt the unspoken understanding settle between them like the last ember of a fire that refused to go out. Whatever Hank Dorsey thought he was building against them, whatever schemes he believed would push them apart, the day had proven the opposite. For the first time, Maggie felt the faint but steady pulse of something stronger than fear, a shared will to stand, not as two people bound by circumstance, but as allies facing the same fight. The night outside was still and clear, yet the memory of Luke's hand on her back, the sound of his voice answering questions as though the words were carved in truth, lingered with her long after she closed her door. And though neither of them would admit it yet, a new crack had formed, not in their defenses, but in the walls they had built to keep their hearts untouched. The day began with a brittle clarity, the kind of autumn morning where the air carried the faint bite of approaching winter, and the streets of Carson City gleamed under a thin veil of frost. Maggie had risen early, her hands busy with the familiar motions of tending the stove, yet her mind was elsewhere. The letter from her anonymous friend, she was almost certain now it had been Sarah, still burned in her thoughts. It had been 2 weeks since the staged inspection, and she had felt the pressure building ever since, like storm clouds gathering just beyond the ridge. Luke came in from the barn before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, his boots heavy on the porch boards. His expression was grim, his jaw set in a way that told her trouble had arrived. "They've done it," he said without preamble. "Dorsey's filed to foreclose on the ranch." Her hand stilled on the handle of the coffee pot. "On what grounds?" "Claims the taxes haven't been paid in full," Luke replied, his voice taut with anger. "He's using forged receipts to show the county that the payments were short. The documents are already in the hands of the officials." For a long moment, Maggie said nothing, then she straightened, her voice low but steady. "Then we go into town, and we don't go quietly." The main street was already alive by the time they arrived, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, the blacksmith's hammer ringing from down the way, townsfolk huddled in small knots of conversation. But as Luke and Maggie stepped down from the wagon, heads turned, and the low murmur of voices followed them toward the courthouse. Inside, the county clerk stood behind the counter, flanked by two officials with solemn faces. And there, in his tailored dark suit and gleaming watch chain, stood Hank Dorsey, his expression wearing the smug ease of a man who believed the game already won. Abigail Keene was beside him, her silk gown a deep plum that seemed chosen to mimic dignity, though the tilt of her chin was sharper than ever. "Mr. Branner," Hank said smoothly, his voice carrying across the room. "Mrs. Branner, I understand this must be unpleasant for you, but business is business. If you cannot meet the county's requirements—" Luke stepped forward, his height casting a long shadow across the polished floor. "Save your speech, Dorsey. You've tried to take this ranch from the start, and now you've stooped to forging county records to make it happen." The room stilled. One of the officials cleared his throat. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Branner." "It's more than an accusation," Luke said, pulling a folded sheet from his coat. "This is the testimony of Sarah Whitaker, witnessed and signed, stating she overheard Hank Dorsey offering bribes to a county employee. She names the man, the place, and the sum paid." Maggie watched the ripple of unease cross Hank's face before he schooled it back into a mask of disdain. Luke handed the paper to the clerk, then turned back toward the gathered townspeople who had drifted into the doorway, drawn by the rising voices. "This man has preyed on his neighbors," Luke continued, his voice carrying now steady and fierce. "He's pressured honest ranchers to sell for less than their land is worth, and when that failed, he turned to lies and bribes." Abigail's face paled beneath her powder, her eyes darting to the onlookers whose expressions were shifting, some with shock, others with the grim satisfaction of seeing long-suspected truths laid bare. "Luke," Hank began, but the other man cut him off with a sharp, clear tone. "You tried to make it look like my wife and I couldn't hold on to what's ours," Luke said, his gaze never leaving Hank's. The word wife fell into the room with a weight that caught Maggie unprepared. There was no trace of the bargain in his tone, only sincerity, fierce and unflinching. She felt the warmth of it as surely as if he had taken her hand, though she kept her expression composed. The clerk looked from the testimony in his hands to the officials beside him. "We will need to investigate this fully," he said. "If these claims hold, the foreclosure will be nullified and charges may be brought." The murmurs among the townspeople swelled. Maggie could hear snippets. "Always suspected a bribe, but to poor Mrs. Branner," until the clerk's firm voice restored order. Hank's composure cracked. He turned to Abigail, but whatever silent alliance they had shared seemed to falter under the weight of the room's scrutiny. Abigail lifted her chin, but her lips were tight, her eyes darting toward the door as though calculating an exit. When the officials dismissed the gathering, the onlookers spilled out into the sunlight. Luke stayed close beside Maggie as they stepped onto the street. The autumn wind tugged at her skirts, carrying with it the smell of dust and wood smoke. Hank lingered in the shadows of the doorway, but the proud set of his shoulders was gone. By the week's end, Abigail's absence from church was noted by all, and whispers spread that she had boarded the westbound train to California to live with distant relatives. Whatever influence she had wielded in Carson City was gone, dissipated as quickly as the smoke from the engine that carried her away. That evening, Maggie stood on the porch of the ranch house, the sky above her painted in streaks of gold and crimson. Luke joined her without a word, leaning one hand against the railing as they looked out over the fields. The silence between them was not the guarded stillness it had once been, but something warmer, threaded with the memory of his voice in the courthouse. "My wife," For the first time since the will's condition had been read, Maggie felt the ground beneath her feet steady, as if the land itself had acknowledged her claim. The fight was not over, but the day had shifted something both in the town and in her heart. She turned her head slightly, catching Luke's profile in the fading light. His eyes were on the horizon, but she thought she saw the faintest curve of a smile. And though she said nothing, the words he had spoken that morning remained with her, quiet but unshakable, long after the sun slipped behind the hills. The air over the Branner Ranch was still that afternoon, heavy with the scent of drying grass and the faint sweetness of alfalfa carried from the far field. It had been several days since the confrontation at the courthouse, yet a peculiar quiet had settled between Luke and Maggie. Not the wary silence of strangers, nor the brittle stillness of people bound only by necessity, but something different, taut and uncertain. Maggie felt it most in the mornings, when they passed each other in the kitchen. Luke's voice was calm, courteous, yet absent of the small, unspoken exchanges they had begun to share before Hank's schemes came to light. She saw it in the way he looked at her, steady, guarded, as if he were weighing words he never chose to speak. That morning she found herself lingering over the open trunk in her bedroom. She had taken it down from the wardrobe, more out of instinct than decision, and now her hands rested on the smooth wood of the lid. A few folded dresses lay inside, along with her mother's quilt and the spare bonnet she had brought from the Keene house. She did not know if she was truly packing to leave, or if the simple act of gathering her things was a way of bracing her heart. She told herself it was Luke who had changed first. His expression in the days since the courthouse had been one of resolve tinged with distance, as if he had already set some plan in motion, and though he had spoken no word of ending their arrangement, she could feel the approach of it, the way one feels the shadow of a cloud before it passes overhead. In truth, Luke had made his decision 2 nights before. Sitting alone by the cold hearth after Maggie had gone to her room, he had turned the thought over and over. She deserved more than the remnants of a man worn down by years of loss and war. She had stood her ground against Hank Dorsey with a courage that humbled him, and yet she had done so under the weight of a bargain she had never truly chosen. By late afternoon, the sky began to shift. The western horizon darkened into shades of crimson and molten gold, the kind of light that made the land seem both endless and intimate. Luke found her in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow as she dried the last of the supper dishes. "Maggie," he said quietly. She turned, drying her hands on a cloth. "Yes? Walk with me." There was something in his tone, not command, not request, but a steadiness that drew her from the doorway and into the fading light. They crossed the yard in silence, the crunch of their boots against the earth the only sound. Beyond the barn, the pasture opened wide, the grass whispering in the evening breeze. When they reached the fence line, Luke stopped. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but the set of his jaw was visible, strong and troubled. "You've done more for this place than I ever expected," he began, his voice low. "You've worked it as if it were yours by right, and it is. You've faced down Dorsey, and you've endured the talk in town without flinching, but our marriage, it began as a bargain, and I think it's time we end it." The words fell with a weight she had been bracing for, yet hearing them aloud sent a tremor through her. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "If that's what you want, then say it plain. You want me gone." His brow furrowed, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "That's not it." "Then what is it, Luke? Because from where I stand, you've already decided." "I've decided you deserve better than this, better than me," he said, his voice rougher now. "You deserve a choice made out of love, not necessity. And I won't keep you here if it means you've given up that right." Her breath caught, the ache in her chest tightening. "You think I stayed because I had no choice? That every day I've worked beside you, every meal I've set on the table, every night I've slept under this roof, none of it was mine to give?" He shook his head, stepping closer. "I think you've carried more than your share of burdens. and I've no right to add my own." The last light of the sun bled across the sky, painting the pasture in deep reds and shadows. Maggie felt the wind lift the edge of her skirt, carrying with it the faint scent of sage. She thought of the months behind them, the wary beginning, the unspoken understandings, the small acts of care neither had named. She thought of the storm, of his hand hovering near hers, of the way his voice had steadied her before the county officials. "You're a stubborn man, Luke Branner," she said softly, "and you're wrong." Her hand came up, resting lightly on his chest. She felt the rise and fall of his breath beneath her palm. "I may not have come here for love, but I found something I didn't expect. You, this place, what we've built. And if you think I'll walk away because you've decided you're not enough, then you don't know me at all." The space between them seemed to narrow on its own, drawn by a pull neither of them could resist. His hand came to rest against her waist, fingers curling gently into the fabric of her dress. Her gaze lifted to his, and in that suspended moment, the unspoken words of months seemed to press between them. When he kissed her, it was slow, unhurried, a meeting that carried the weight of all the times they had stood too close and said too little. It was not a kiss of possession, nor of farewell, but of recognition, a promise sealed in the quiet rustle of grass and the last light of day. When they parted, her hand still rested against his chest, his breath warm against her temple. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, their written agreement. For a long moment he held it between them, the edges catching the dim light. "I carried this too long," he said. She took it from his hand. Together, without ceremony, they tore it down the middle. The sound was soft, final. The pieces drifted to the ground, caught briefly in the breeze before settling in the grass. "We stay," she said simply. "We stay," he echoed, his voice steady now. They stood there until the last of the sun slipped below the horizon, the sky deepening into twilight. And as they turned back toward the house side by side, the weight that had hung between them was gone, replaced by something new, something chosen. The winter had come and gone, leaving the valleys washed in the green of early spring. Days stretched longer now, and the ranch seemed to hum with quiet prosperity. Where once the fences sagged and the barn roof bore the scars of years of wind, now every post stood straight, every shingle secure. The pasture rolled out in swaths of emerald and gold, dotted with grazing cattle whose coats gleamed in the sunlight. Luke Branner rode the fence line at dawn, the breath of his horse rising in soft clouds before the sun burned them away. From the hill he could see the house, fresh paint on the porch rails, a new curtain fluttering at the kitchen window. Inside, he knew Maggie would be at the long table in the front room, ledger open, pen moving steadily as she balanced the ranch books. It had been her doing as much as his, the turn in their fortunes. She had taken to the accounts with a sharp mind and steady hand, tracing every dollar and cent until the debts that had once weighed Luke's shoulders were paid in full. He had never spoken much of those debts before, but she had known, and she had worked alongside him until the last of them was cleared. When he returned to the yard that morning, she was already outside, skirts gathered neatly as she knelt to inspect the flower beds she had coaxed into life beside the porch. She wore a straw hat that cast a soft shadow across her face, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. On her left hand, the gold of a new wedding band caught the light, matching the one that gleamed on his. "You've been out since first light," she said, looking up with a faint smile. "And you've been working since before that," he replied, dismounting and looping the reins over the hitching post. His gaze lingered on her, a moment longer than needed, as if to remind himself that she was not here because of a bargain, but because she had chosen to be. By midday, preparations for the barn gathering were underway. It had been rebuilt with the help of neighbors, and now it stood tall and proud, its wide doors thrown open to welcome the community. The scent of fresh timber mixed with the aroma of baking bread and roasting meat drifting from the outdoor cook fires. People came from miles around, ranchers, townsfolk, families with children tugging at their hands. Maggie moved among them with a grace that was neither hesitant nor overly bold, greeting each with quiet warmth. The gossip that had once followed her in whispers seemed a thing of the past. Now the words she overheard were of respect, of admiration for the woman who had stood her ground when others might have yielded. Sarah Whitaker arrived with a basket of preserves, her eyes lighting when she saw Maggie. They embraced briefly, and Sarah's voice carried the soft note of satisfaction that only comes when the right ending has found its way. "You've done it, Maggie," she said. "You and Luke both." Inside the barn, long tables were set end to end, laden with dishes brought by every household. Laughter rose above the music of a fiddle and the steady thump of boots on the packed earth floor. Luke stood near the entrance, speaking with a group of ranchers, but his eyes found Maggie often, as if to keep her within the easy reach of his gaze. In one quiet moment, old Mr. Hadley, whose land bordered theirs to the east, approached Maggie. "Mrs. Branner," he said with a tip of his hat, "I misjudged you at the start. I'll admit it plain, but seeing what you've made of this place, well, I reckon the town owes you more than it's given." Maggie met his eyes and nodded, the words settling warmly in her chest. She had not sought the town's approval, but it was not unwelcome now that it came without strings. As the afternoon waned, the light slanted through the barn's open doors, painting everything in the burnished gold of early evening. Luke came to her then, his hand finding hers as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Together they stepped outside, the murmur of voices and the scent of wood smoke following them. Across the street, a small cluster of townsfolk spoke in low tones, their eyes following the figure of Hank Dorsey as he crossed toward the stagecoach stop. His fine suit had lost its luster, the lines of his face carved deeper by the months of defeat. Word had spread that his holdings were gone, his influence stripped away. Without ceremony, he boarded the waiting coach, and by the time it rolled out, turning toward the distant hills, no one seemed inclined to call him back. Maggie watched without speaking. There was no triumph in her gaze, only the quiet certainty of a chapter closed. Luke's thumb brushed lightly over the back of her hand, grounding her in the moment. The sun was slipping low now, casting the Nevada sky in shades of rose and violet that deepened into indigo. From where they stood, the land stretched endlessly, the air holding that stillness that comes only when day yields fully to night. Luke turned to her, his voice low, meant for her alone. "This time," he murmured, "it's not an oath, it's a promise." Her fingers tightened around his, the warmth of his hand steady and sure. They stood together in the gathering dusk, watching as the first stars began to pierce the deepening blue, the sounds of the barn fading into the distance. And in that quiet, with the horizon stretching wide before them, Maggie knew the truth of it, not as a vow bound by necessity, but as something freely chosen, carried forward into whatever lay ahead. The Nevada sky was the same vast blue it had always been, but the years had softened its edges. The wind still carried the scent of sagebrush and sun-warmed earth, yet to Maggie Branner, standing on the porch of the ranch house, everything felt richer, fuller, alive with the life she and Luke had built together. It had been 5 years since the day they tore their contract in two. 5 years of seasons turning, of winters spent by the hearth and summers that stretched long and golden across the pasture. The ranch had grown under their care. New fences bordered lush grazing fields, the barn stood weathered but strong, and the herd had doubled. Inside, the sound of children's laughter spilled through the open door. Their son, James, a boy of 4 with Luke's steel-gray eyes and Maggie's quiet determination, darted past her on the porch, a wooden toy horse clutched in his small hands. His little sister Clara, only 2 years old, followed in a toddling run, her dark hair curling against her cheeks. Maggie's heart swelled at the sight of them, at the thought that these children had been born into a home built not by chance, but by choice. Luke stepped out onto the porch, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened by sun and years, but softened by the easy smile he wore now. He stood for a moment, watching the children chase each other through the yard, before slipping an arm around Maggie's waist. "They're going to wear themselves out before supper," he said. "That's the hope," she replied, leaning against him. The years had not dulled the bond between them. If anything, time had made it stronger. They still worked side by side each day, Luke in the fields, Maggie in the books and tending the home. But they had learned the quiet art of resting together too. There was no longer a trace of the guarded man she had first met, nor of the woman who had once braced herself for every blow life might deliver. Beyond the ranch, the town had changed. The Miller farm had passed to their eldest son, and Sarah Whitaker, still Maggie's dearest friend, now ran the schoolhouse, teaching children who had once played in the barn during community gatherings. The gossip that had once shadowed Maggie's name was long gone, replaced with a kind of steady respect. Not everyone had found such peace. Abigail Keene had never returned to Carson City. Word came once that she had married a widower in San Francisco, but those who knew her said she never regained the social footing she had once commanded. As for Hank Dorsey, he had died 2 years before in a mining town far to the south, alone, his fortune gone, his name a cautionary tale whispered among those who remembered. The sun was sinking low now, casting the yard in the warm amber light of late afternoon. Luke's hand found Maggie's, their fingers lacing with the ease of habit and the weight of promise. The children's laughter rang out one last time before James tumbled into the grass, his sister collapsing beside him in giggles. Maggie glanced at Luke, and he met her gaze with the same steady warmth that had carried them through storms and seasons alike. 5 years, she murmured. "And everyone worth it," he said. They stood together, watching their children in the golden light, the Nevada sky stretching wide above them. The world had shifted around them, neighbors had come and gone, fortunes had risen and fallen, but their love had endured, not because it had been born of grand declarations, but because it had been chosen every day, in small acts, in quiet moments, in the life they had built hand in hand. And as the sun slipped beyond the horizon, the first stars flickering in the deepening blue, Maggie knew that whatever years still lay ahead, they would meet them the same way they had met all the rest, together. Every story leaves behind more than words. It leaves echoes. Maggie and Luke's journey was not only about surviving betrayal, facing down enemies, or protecting a ranch against the odds. It was about the courage to choose love over fear, truth over pretense, and hope over resignation. Their path reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are not won in courts or on battlefields, but in quiet kitchens, at shared tables, and in the gentle clasp of a hand that refuses to let go. Love, when nurtured with patience and mutual respect, can weather storms, silence the loudest doubts, and grow stronger with every passing year. Now, dear listener, I'd love to know, what part of their journey touched your heart the most? Write the word promise in the comments, so I'll know you stayed with me until the very last moment. If you feel moved to support the team that makes these stories possible, you can send a super thanks on YouTube for whatever amount you wish. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps us keep bringing you more tales like this. And if that's not possible right now, simply sharing this story with a friend or loved one is another beautiful way to keep it alive. I invite you to explore more stories like this one, the kind that stir the soul and linger in your memory, by checking the other narrations linked in the cards. Thank you for riding along with us on this journey. Until the next story, may you always find your own promise under the wide, endless sky.